Okay, hopefully at this point you've gone through your skills check, you've watched the video that kind of explained how to work those out. Hopefully they made sense. Hopefully also you've checked your homework and have an idea of what's going on there. I wanted to work through a couple of these problems with you to help prepare you for your assessment that's coming up in the next couple minutes. So for this first section it says factor each polynomial. This one's a 4-term polynomial. So when you see 4 terms, the first thing you should be thinking is, I'm going to be doing factoring by grouping. But also you should be thinking, look for a greatest common factor. So first, is there a greatest common factor here? The answer is no. So we're going to go through and we're going to do our grouping process and see what happens. So in this first group, we're asking ourselves, what's the greatest common factor? Well, that's going to be f squared. So what's left over? That's f minus 4. What's the greatest common factor here? Well, that's negative 9. And I'm still left with f minus 4. Now this is a good thing because when we do factor by grouping, we want what's in parentheses to be the same on both sides. So here we've got f squared minus 9 times f minus 4. Now normally we'd be thinking, okay, we're done. But what we want to do when we factor completely is to go here to this point and look at both of our binomials and ask ourselves, can we factor these further? Well, in this case, the answer is yes, we can factor these further because this right here is the difference of 2 squares. F is a perfect square, 9 is also a perfect square, so when we factor those down, you get f minus 3 times f plus 3 times, in this case, f minus 4, which is just left over. That's going to get moved down. At this point, we factored this as far as we can possibly go, so that's going to be your answer for number 5, and that's why you get 3 different binomials as opposed to just 2 like we're used to seeing. Okay, I'm going to slide my paper here. I want to do number 6 with you as well. This is going to be the same idea. First thing you're going to do is look and see, do I have any greatest common factors? Well, the answer here is yes. I've got p's in both, and I've also got r's in both of my terms. So the first greatest common factor is p cubed. Now we look at our r's. Well, I've got r and r to the 5th, so they both at least have an r. What's left over? Well, take the p cubed out. It's going to be r to the 4th minus, in this case, 1. Okay? Because I'm factoring out this entire term. Now, am I done? Well, you want to look at this and see, can I factor it further? Well, when you have an even exponent, you can factor that further. So again, your p cubed r is just going to hang out up front. This is a difference of 2 squares because the square root of 1 is 1. So you have r squared minus 1, r squared plus 1. So again, now you're thinking, okay, am I done? Well, you want to double check again to see if you can factor anything further. And this one does indeed factor further. So what's still hanging out? P cubed r. R squared plus 1 now is still hanging out, because I can't factor that further. It's 2 perfect squares, but it's not the difference, it's the sum. So the big deal here is this minus sign. So this is going to factor down to r minus 1 times r plus 1. And at this point, you're looking to see, can I factor anything any further? The answer is no, so that's your answer for number 6. Number 10 is a story problem, and this was the one with Ms. Flogel throws a rock off a 50-foot cliff with an initial velocity of 34 feet per second, and it's asking how long does it take for the rock to hit the ground. So she's standing on a 50-foot cliff, so we're going to take that as being our initial height. This is the initial vertical velocity of 34 feet per second, and when the rock hits the ground, that's when h is equal to 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug these values into my vertical motion model. H is 0, that's the final height. Negative 16t squared doesn't ever change. We have 34t, because 34 is my v value, my velocity, initial velocity, and my initial height here is 50. So one thing that's great about this example here is when you're solving a quadratic equation, you want everything to be on one side of your equal sign. So you want to set it equal to 0, which we have. Now you also want to look to see, is there any greatest common factors? And in this case, there are. We also want to make sure that our leading coefficient is positive. So because this is negative, I'm going to divide everything by the greatest common factor, which in this case is negative 2. And the reason I'm dividing by this negative is to make this term positive. So 0 divided by anything is 0. So that's pretty straightforward. Now here I'm going to divide each term by that negative 2. So negative 16t squared divided by negative 2 is 8t squared. 34 divided by negative 2 is negative 17t. And then 50 divided by negative 2 is negative 25. So what essentially I've done is I've gotten rid of the negative for my leading coefficient. And then when I divide by the negative, notice how my signs change for both my terms. I've also made my numbers smaller, which makes it easier to do this A, C, and then rewriting everything. So A times C is going to be 8 times 25, negative 25, which is negative 200. So now here you may be thinking, okay, what are my factors of negative 200? Well, you know that 8 is a factor, and you know that negative 25 is a factor because those are the numbers we just multiplied together. So we want to get negative 17. It just so happens that negative 25 times 8 is equal to negative 200. It also happens that when we add these together, we get negative 17. So this one doesn't have to be too challenging if you are paying attention to what you're doing. So you've got 8t squared minus 25t plus 8t, because I'm rewriting that middle term, minus 25. Now you go through and you group. So the greatest common factor here is t, 8t minus 25. There is no common factor other than 1, so I'm going to put that out front because that's my greatest common factor, 8t minus 25. Notice how my parentheses are the same. So I've got 0 equals t plus 1, 8t minus 25. Okay? So I'm solving here, so this is where you draw your line, and you're going to set both of these parentheses equal to 0, because this is the zero product property. If you multiply two things together, one of them has to give you 0. So when you solve this one, you get t is equal to negative 1. When you solve this one, you get 8t is equal to 25. Divide both sides by 8. T is equal to 25 over 8, which is, I believe, 3.125. Now, both of these are representing seconds. It does not make sense necessarily for time to be negative. So, with that in mind, this is going to be your answer. That's how long it's going to take for that rock to hit the ground after Miss Flogel throws it. The last problem that I want to work through with you is this one right here, number 12. And the reason I want to work through this one is we're still solving here, but it's going to be helpful again to recognize that everything's on one side, I've got it equal to 0, and there is a greatest common factor between these terms. So what I can do is I can factor out a 2. So I'm dividing everything by 2. And when I do that, 6x squared divided by 2 is 3x squared. Negative 34 divided by 2 is negative 17x. And then 48 divided by 2 is 24. Okay? All that's still going to be equal to 0. So a times c, just like we normally do, you're taking 3 and multiplying that by 24. And if I know my math correctly, that should be 72. So you're asking yourself, what factors of 72 have a sum of negative 17? So because this is positive and this is negative, both of our factors have to be negative. Both our factors are negative. So what factors of 72 add up to being negative 17? Well, 8 and 9 both multiply to give me 72. And when I add 8 and I add 9 together, I get negative 17. So those are going to be the factors I'm working with. So it helps to know your factors. Extremely helpful to know your factors. So you're rewriting that middle term. Again, make sure you include that negative when you do your grouping. Pull out the greatest common factor. And a lot of this is going to sound repetitive because the process does not change. I want this to be in my parentheses here. So what's the greatest common factor in my other one? It's 3. But in this case, I want to have 3x minus 8. So I'm going to pull out a negative 3, which changes this first one to positive and the second one to a negative. That's going to be equal to 0 still. Now when I do my last grouping, notice how my parentheses are the same. X minus 3 times 3x minus 8 is equal to 0. Now the one last step when you're solving,